Welcome to Philosophical Conversations. I'm Sarah Jane Leslie. In today's political arena, environmentalism is far more associated with left-wing thinking than with right-wing thinking. Conservation is just often not seen as being in any way a conservative value. But given that environmentalism is concerned with such things as the depletion of natural resources and the preservation of the beauty of our homeland, it may seem that rather than being a partisan issue, it should really be thought of as primarily a patriotic issue. Indeed, in 1910, President Theodore Roosevelt said, "Conservation is a great moral issue, for it involves the patriotic duty of ensuring the safety and continuance of the nation." In a recent book entitled How to Think Seriously About the Planet, or Green Philosophy as per its UK edition, conservative thinker Roger Scruton offers a distinctively right-wing take on the case of environmentalism. He argues that certain human motivations that may be powerful tools for solving these issues are overlooked by the left-wing approaches. In particular, he argues that patriotism and love of home may be important human motivations that will inspire people to tackle these problems, and further argues that these sorts of motivating factors can be all too often overlooked by more abstract, top-down, government-driven approaches to the issue. As American writer, poet, and environmental activist Wendell Berry puts it, "No settled family or community has ever called its home place an environment. None has ever called its feeling for its home place biocentric or anthropocentric. The concepts and insights of the ecologists are of great usefulness in our predicament, but the terms themselves are culturally sterile. They come from the juiceless, abstract intellectuality of the universities, which was invented to disconnect, displace, and disembody the mind. The real names of the environment are the names of rivers and river valleys, creeks, ridges and mountains, towns and cities, lakes, woodlands, lanes, roads, creatures, and people." We're joined today by Professor Roger Scruton, who is one of the leading conservative thinkers of our time. Professor Scruton is currently a senior scholar at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and is visiting professor at St. Andrews University and Oxford University. Professor Scruton, thanks so much for joining us here on Philosophical Conversations. So why, in your opinion, is this perceived as a left-wing issue and not a right-wing issue?
Well, I think it offers, first of all, an opportunity to left-wing activists who have, as it were, lost their traditional causes. Socialism is largely discredited by the whole Soviet experiment and everything that came out of it. And the issues since then, like feminism, animal rights and so on, they've sort of entered the mainstream of politics and been, as it were, diluted. But this is a big issue, a huge issue, which enables people to stand once again as the heroic defenders of mankind against the predators being big business, those who are making a profit out of the destruction of the earth and so on.
Now, if this is not to be thought of as a party politics issue, how should we think about this issue?
Of course, a conservative like me would say that's what conservatism has always been about. So, although it's not party political, it has this political aspect to it. In conserving things, you're accepting that the existing order has some priority over the schemes to replace it with something else.
Now, isn't one challenge that's only emerged fairly recently, and which seems to have some kind of political aspect to it, really the challenge of big business?
You have to ask yourself, what is the alternative? In Europe, the alternative to the big businesses was the nationalized industries, which, and in Russia, everything was in the hands of the state. Now, when everything's in the hands of the state, there isn't anything independent that can control it. The state controls the law and the industries, so it can always get out of any law that has been set up for environmental protection. This is something that we saw in Britain with the rivers after the last war. They were all polluted, and fish had all died, and they were polluted because the energy industries and the sewage disposal industries poured all their waste into the rivers. And they were finally cleaned up, not by the state, because although the state passed a law about pollution, the polluters were those state-controlled industries. All they did was pay the fine and carry on. But when individuals set up a trust, the Anglers Association, which wanted the rivers to be clean, and actually sued for an injunction in the court of law, then it stopped. Because an injunction is a wonderful device of English law which actually makes a civil offence into a crime. Because if the person then goes on pouring in the waste into the river, he's in defiance of a court order. So then, for the first time, the rivers were cleaned, not by the state, but against the state. And I think this is something that we have to remember. Big business is potentially threatening, but it also can only be controlled by the law, and the law must be in the hands of the people, as it is with our common law system, if we're really to get what we want.
Now that sounds like an argument for government regulation of business, which is not something one tends to find on the right.
No, but this is where the question becomes really interesting. Because as I see it, environmental questions are really questions about practical reason, questions about how we as citizens get together to solve a problem which is of concern to each of us, but concerning which we might not have the same motive. One of these paradoxes of social choice, as they're called, is the so-called tragedy of the commons, where something is held in common, like a lake full of fish. Everybody has the right to fish in it. Nobody owns it. It's a common piece of common land. In such a circumstance, each person has a motive to take as much as he can before other people take it from him. Mm-hmm. So the inevitable result is it's overfished and it dies. How do you solve that kind of problem? Okay, one answer is state regulation. Tell people that each person can only take so much fish, and if he takes more than that, he's committed an offence. And that is a perfectly reasonable solution. It's a top-down solution. It tends to be put in the hands of bureaucrats. But it's not the only solution. Another solution is, in fact, a free market solution. That's to say, give each person a share of a private property in the lake. Each person, say, owns a 20th of it, and then let them bargain among themselves, so that the person who doesn't really like fishing sells his share to another, etc., until finally one person who really wants this resource owns it, and owning it has the best possible interest in conserving it. And that's how many of the traditional fisheries among the Indian tribes in this country solved the problem of the overfishing of the rivers. The great question is, when is top-down regulation the right solution, and when is some kind of bottom-up solution, cooperative solution, the right one?
You might wonder that the bottom-up cooperative solution would work very well in, say, the context you were just pointing to, when it's a smaller community, more agriculture-based community. But if the person who's bought up all the rights to that lake is, say, a multinational corporation responsible only to its shareholders, maybe they have, in fact, an incentive to fish that lake dry and then move on to the next lake.
There you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. If ownership of the common thing passes to some other local person, then of course who's living there, he has a motive to make that lake a sustainable resource. If, however, it's brought up by somebody who can quickly make a profit and move elsewhere, then you're in a very different situation. And that is precisely where regulation has, on the whole, been thought of as the only possible solution. Now, it isn't the only possible solution, in fact, what we're dealing with is what the economists call the externalities, the externalization of costs. The person who is taking the profit from this lake and moving on is leaving the cost to others, namely to the neighbours of it, who is the long-term cost of living with a sterile resource like that, which might have been a sustainable resource. Businesses do this all the time. They're not always penalised for it. For instance, supermarkets sell all their goods wrapped in plastic. The cost of that plastic is being borne by future generations, because it's immortal. It will end up in the oceans as it does, poisoning fish, and it's going to eventually cover the earth with a horrid veneer of detritus. We know that this is wrong, and that the real cost should be borne by the supermarket. There should be a regulation saying that supermarkets must take back the packaging and dispose of it properly.
So that would be an instance where you would favour government intervention?
Yeah, some intervention is necessary because of the nature of the externality that is being passed on not to a living individual but to unborn generations.
Would you say that specifically where market solutions fail is when there is this problem of externalities, where the person who's making the profit and imposing a cost is not the one who's actually bearing that cost?
Absolutely. I wouldn't say that market solutions fail there, but that it isn't a genuine market solution. A market solution is one where each agent bears the cost of his own activity. And in the case of this exploitation of common resources, Eleanor Ostrom has done a lot of research on how this is done in small communities all over the world, where people are able to internalise the costs of using them by ensuring that there is some form of genuine private property in them, even if it's collective ownership of the local community. It's when But outside that, when something an enterprise becomes very big and is able to pass on costs invisibly, then that's where the problem arises. And I agree that probably there has to be regulation there. We don't recognise sufficiently that we already have mechanisms for doing this, for preventing people from externalising their costs. I refer to the case of the anglers in Britain. What they did by suing for an injunction against these state-controlled businesses was force those businesses to internalise their costs using a device of ordinary common law or equity, the injunction. And there are lots of devices like that have emerged over time, in the law of tort especially, which can be used by ordinary people to force others to internalise their costs. And I think it's underuse of those which has led to the overuse of regulation. The problem with regulation, the main problem as I see it, is that it's extremely difficult to reverse it. When a court of law makes a mistaken judgment, another court of law can reverse it straight away. When a parliament passes a piece of unwise legislation, the next parliament can reverse it. But when bureaucrats make regulations, they do so in a way which is almost impossible to reverse, because they're not accountable to the people who are victims of it. And there's no process, a feedback process, which says, no, you've got it wrong, we've got to change that. This is a very real problem in the European Union, of course, where most of this legislation is bureaucratic.
So this is another example, in a sense, where the appropriate feedback loop isn't in place. It's not exactly the costs being externalized, but the people who are making these decisions aren't responsible.
That's right.
But just to go back for a minute to the point you were making about ordinary citizens being able to sue, say, corporations who are damaging in their area, well, of course, they have the right to sue, but in the vast majority of cases, they're going to stand very little chance of winning when the corporation has a financial war chest behind them that no citizen can match.
There are problems there, and in our legal system, in England at least, there are attempts both to keep down the costs and also to make funds available through legal aid to those who can't fund themselves. But if citizens feel strongly enough about something, they can get those funds together like the anglers did. And of course, when the judgment goes against the corporation, it has to pay the costs.
Well, if it goes against the corporation.
Yeah, but you have to then to be fairly sure you've got a case. But that's what justice requires. Justice doesn't require constant, irritating litigation of a nuisance kind. It does require, but it does allow. It encourages rather those people who have a genuine case to come forward.
But again, you just might be concerned that that's, while in principle correct, not in practice, the case.
Look at it this way. In my book on this topic, what concerns me is that people have got the structure of the problem wrong. You know, that it's all to do with large actors being uncontrollable, and what we need is something standing above them to control them. In my view, it's not to do with that. It's to do with the fact that people can externalize their costs, small people as well as big people, and that their victims can't hold them accountable. And so we need to look into all the ways in which people can be held to account for what they do, and all the motives that others have for doing this, for actually holding them to account. And that's where I think the environmental movement has been remiss. It has not explored those motives, and it has not explored those natural mechanisms that emerge through a rule of law, which are already available to us. So it has surrendered the whole issue to the hands of not just of the big boys, but those who are bigger than them. You know, so it wants to create even bigger things to control the big things that are doing the damage, whereas in fact what we need to do is empower the little things to hold everybody to account.
And how do you think we would go about doing that?
Well, I think we must first of all recognize that there are legal remedies available and clarify those remedies, and also remove all the corruption from them. In America, the law of tort is more or less unusable now because of this absurd item in the American Constitution, which requires the decisions to be taken by a jury and not by a judge, which means that it can all be corrupted, tort law, by choosing the right jury.
More bottom up than top down, though?
Well, it's no, because it means that lawyers have the control of the process rather than the person who is suing. But you know, that's one of the things that needs to be clarified. But I think making available remedies to ordinary people, then also animating the spirit of oikophilia, as I call it,
the love of home.
The love of home, which is there in all of us, and which already motivates us to look after our environment as long as we can regard it as ours. Well, again, if you take this top-down approach, it's bound to disorient that motive, to make people think it's not about me and my place, it's about them and the whole of things. You know, so the whole problem becomes a huge global problem, a fight in the skies between the demons. And people then just back off and say, there's nothing I can do, and just leave the environment to look after itself. But in fact, there's everything we can do about our local community, then moving out from there. And there are initiatives everywhere that people take, like those that I mentioned, which have the long-term effect of making the environment sustainable.
So to the extent that these problems are taken out of the hands of individuals and individual communities and placed in the hands of large, abstract governing entities, we lose this particular oikophilic motivation to address the problem.
You say that just as well as Wendell Berry.
Well, I'm not sure about that. But in this day and age, one might think that at a certain point in history that might have absolutely been correct. But now we're facing problems that aren't on a local scale and therefore aren't addressable on a local scale. And I'm thinking, like many people, that a clear example of this is that of global warming. There's nothing that I can do locally in Princeton that will actually practically affect a change in this regard. Don't we need something on the global level to confront a problem like global warming?
Of course, it's true that there are resources on which we depend. The oceans is one of them, as well as the air, which transcend the reach of any private property arrangement. So they can't be protected in the way that we would naturally protect things around us by staking a claim to them and saying, look, I'm going to look after this. And we know it's not just the atmosphere, it is the oceans too that are seriously at risk. Of course, one way of answering this risk is through some kind of global governance which controls what people do. But it's unrealistic. It's unreal. We've had attempts at treaties like the Kyoto Treaty, but as I argue in my book, a treaty is only of use if it is signed by law-abiding states. The principal polluter in the modern world is China, which is not a law-abiding state. There's nothing in the Chinese constitution or in the relation between the Communist Party and the state there, which enables any citizen to put any pressure at all on his government to obey a treaty. So what's the point of signing treaties? We know that they're just a piece of showmanship, a public relations exercise in the international sphere. But in this particular case, it seems to me, therefore, we have to look in another direction. The real solution, the only long-term solution that I can envisage, and I think many people would agree with this, is to liberate ourselves from polluting sources of energy. And that means
define technologically speaking a clean energy source.
Yeah, and that's a scientific problem, and this means investing in the scientific research necessary.
Public funding.
That would be the best use of public funds. Stop going to jetting around the world to international gatherings where you have 7-course meals every day and all the rest. But stay in your university, in Princeton or wherever it is, and just work 10 hours a day in that laboratory and keep in contact with people doing it elsewhere until you've got that thing, nuclear fusion or wherever it might be. And then, when you've got the cheap version of it, just make it available around the globe. That's something that a patriotic American can support for the sake of his country and also for the sake of the world. But it depends upon something which I think is, again, marginalized by the left-wing environmental movement, which is patriotism. The love of your own country, the desire to save it, and the pouring of resources into it. We know that the solution to all these problems will either come from America or not at all.
So someone motivated by oikophilia, by patriotism, and also publicly funded in their research might be able to find the sort of solution that would enable us long-term to confront this problem.
That's what I would hope. I don't see any other hope. Mind you, of course, the global warming thing is all terribly controversial because many people say, look, it's going to benefit the planet, or that this is only a temporary thing, or we don't really understand all the variables involved. And that part of the problem is because the science has become politicized, ordinary people have just sort of backed off and said, this is all a scam, this is just people trying to manipulate us. And that is a shame because, here is something that could be a major problem, but needs to be looked at much more impartially than it is.
And what would your thoughts be on the source of this public funding? Is there a way to connect that with removing these incentives to pollute, replacing the externalities back upon the heads of the offenders?
Well, this is quite a lot of people have thought about this. Scientific advance occurred in the 17th century at a huge rate because patrons were prepared to pick up the bill. So all those people like Boyle and Faraday and so on. They had their patrons, these wealthy aristocrats who loved to, wanted to join the Royal Society and all the rest, and have their pet scientists at heel. Private patronage has given way to public patronage. We've got to recognise that. Although here in America, wonderfully, you have universities that can raise funds from alumni like you do in Princeton, which supplements these public funds. If universities don't get these funds, then they do just the wrong thing, namely they look to patent their research and get the funding that way. And through patents, of course, you stop the sharing of information necessary to make the big advance. So I think without public funding, the rule of the need of universities for private profit from their discoveries will actually kill this off.
But just going back to this issue of externalities and how to confront them, how would you feel, for example, about a solution involving a carbon tax?
Well, it's better than trying to prevent people using carbon-based fuels altogether, because you can't do that. The problem with such taxes, like taxes on alcohol and tobacco and so on, they give the government an interest in people going on drinking and smoking, and likewise it'll be creating a government interest in people using as much fossil fuels as possible in order to pay that tax. So this is what was advocated, of course, by Pigou, the economist, precisely because he couldn't think of any other solution. But it's bound to be a temporary solution. But such solutions have an awkward habit of becoming permanent. What I would say is that in the end, we've got to get people behind the idea of research on this. We've got to stop them panicking, because I think that is something which alienates people from the whole idea of doing anything at all, and give them a sense that it's their home that they're looking after. There is something they can do, and educating people, for instance, to demand of supermarkets that they sell food unwrapped. Make little progress here and there, and I think some progress is being made at that kind. My own feeling is that we philosophers have a role to play here, which is unusual because we're a useless breed on the whole, but our role is to explore the motive of oikophilia, to try to understand it in all its complexity, the aspects like the love of beauty, the Heimatsgefühl that the German Romantic poets put before us, showing exactly what it is that motivates people to attach themselves to things, and how they can retain that attachment even while being at a distance from it. These are questions of partly of psychology, but also of the philosophical account of what human beings are, how they actually perceive and act upon their world. And I would like to see more philosophers thinking in those lines.
Even though one might intuitively associate environmentalism with left-wing rather than right-wing thinking, it is an issue that affects everyone. As Professor Scruton's green philosophy illustrates, conservative thinkers have a distinctive voice to add to this pressing discussion. Professor Scruton, thank you so much for coming on Philosophical Conversations. Great to have you with us.
All right, great to be here.